You were never meant to hear this story. The old men in the Ozarks still lower their voices when they speak its name, as if the hills themselves might be listening and remembering. It begins on a rain-heavy night in 1867, when two travelers disappeared on the road between Springfield and the wild valleys of the Current River, and only their horses returned, caked with mud and fear. Locals whispered about the Stillwell brothers, proprietors of a roadside inn that promised warm meals and clear water to weary souls making their way through the post-war frontier. Yet the walls of that inn soaked up more than hospitality. They soaked up screams. Imagine the flicker of lantern light against rough-hewn beams, the smell of wet leather and iron, and a pair of brothers smiling too widely as they ladled water into tin cups, while their eyes measured the weight of coin purses and the strength of arms. In that moment, you step into their threshold. You feel the weight of silence pressing at the back of your skull, and you know something is wrong, but you drink anyway, because you are tired and cold, and you want to believe in kindness along the road. This was a time when records vanished easily, when a man could be swallowed by forest, and rumor leaving no trace but a name, carved into a ledger and a faint stain on pine boards. The Stillwell brothers learned to exploit that silence, turning it into an invisible net, catching drifters, merchants, former soldiers, anyone carrying valuables, and a story no one would miss. Those who lived near the inn tell of a heavy trapdoor in the kitchen floor, a door that led to darkness beneath the earth, a space where the water was not water and the meals were not meals, but the beginning of an unmarked grave. You stand now at the edge of that threshold, hearing the storm outside and the low hum of a song one of the brothers sang as he stirred his pot, a melody older than the hills. Melody meant to lure you deeper into the hollow where the law could not reach and where the ledger of vanished souls began. The Ozarks of 1867 were not a blank space on a map. They were a living labyrinth of limestone caves, rushing creeks, and oak ridges where moonlight was swallowed whole and sound traveled strangely through hollows. Every mile of trail between Springfield and the Current River was lined with stories of disappearances and hidden camps. Yet the Stillwell Inn stood apart because it promised safety, warmth and water in a land where both were scarce. Travelers arriving at dusk would see a flicker of yellow light against the black trees and feel a surge of relief at the sight of the brothers waiting on the porch. Hands clasped in greeting, smiles too slow and deliberate to be called friendly. Inside the walls hung with antlers and tattered flags, a pot simmered on the stove, and a jug of spring water sat on the table, catching the glow of lantern light like liquid amber. It was a ritual to offer a drink before a meal. The brothers believed in rituals, not the kind a church might bless, but the kind that bound a stranger to their threshold and numbed the tongue before questions could be asked. They kept ledgers of every guest, or so they claimed, yet the pages were filled with false names and smeared ink in columns that never balanced a record-keeping system that hid, rather than revealed. Whispers of their cruelty began with teamsters who noticed wagons disappearing, with only oxen returning with merchants whose goods never reached their destination, and with families whose letters home ceased after a night at the inn. But in that decade, law moved slowly across the hills. Sheriffs were elected by neighbors, and justice depended on who held the rifle and who held the coin. The Stillwell brothers understood this power and fed it with gifts to the right men and threats to the wrong ones, until their inn became more than a stop on the road. It became a funnel into darkness. If you listen to the old songs sung by hunters around these ridges, you can still hear the refrain about two brothers who served more than water, and about a cellar where no prayer reached, only echo. The deeper you travel into the story, the more the air itself begins to feel heavy, as if the ridges and hollows of the Ozarks still remember what happened beneath their canopies. By the spring of 1867, the Stillwell brothers had perfected a system of approach that was almost ceremonial, and every detail was crafted to draw a man closer until it was too late to turn back. A rider would crest the final hill at dusk, bone-weary from days of travel, and see the lanterns swaying in front of the inn, like beacons of sanctuary, the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat drifting upward through the mist. Inside the entry hall, a battered Bible sat open on a desk, its pages covered in handwritten notes of guests long gone. A strange ledger of scripture, and names meant to signal piety, but hiding something far colder. The brothers had an art for conversation. Their voices low and measured their questions harmless sounding, but designed to draw out the contents of a man's purse and the state of his soul. One would pour water from the spring into a tin cup, his sleeve brushing the guest's hand as if in welcome, while the other adjusted something behind the bar where small glass bottles sat like soldiers lined up for war. The spring water had a taste no traveler could quite place crisp but faintly bitter, and soon after drinking it, men found themselves slower, weaker, less inclined to resist offers of a spare room for the night. The Stillwell Inn was not a place of random violence. It was a machine built from trust, ritual, and geography. It turned strangers into offerings and left no trace but hoofprints leading away without riders. Rumors began to circulate in the settlements downstream of men vanishing merchants whose wagons never arrived, sons who wrote letters home from the road then vanished into silence. Yet in a time when telegraphs were rare and justice was a rumor, the brothers thrived on this slowness too, earning every mile of backcountry into a curtain drawn across their deeds. This is the threshold where legend hardens into something sharper than folklore, where hospitality becomes a weapon and a drink of water can open the first gate into oblivion. By the end of 1867, the Stillwell cabin had become a kind of invisible snare, hidden under the guise of frontier generosity. Neighbors might pass on horseback and see smoke rising from the chimney, hear a fiddle tune drifting out the open window, and think nothing of it. Inside the walls were lined with rough-hewn shelves stacked with jars, herbs, powders, and roots collected from the surrounding hills, each labeled in the neat hand of Joshua Hartley, who called himself Jeremiah Stillwell. He told visitors these were for poultices and teas to help with headaches or fevers. Yet some of the plants he collected were known among midwives as powerful sedatives or dangerous poisons. The table in the center of the cabin was always set with mismatched plates, bowls of stew and fresh bread, the air thick with the smell of herbs, masking the gamey tang of whatever meat simmered in the pot. Travelers weary from the road would sit feeling the warmth of the fire and the pull of sleep, as the brothers spoke in low, even voices, weaving tales of Kentucky and family hardship tales meant to build a bridge of trust. In the smokehouse behind the cabin, hooks hung empty in daylight, but at night, heavy shapes dripped slowly into pans, set below the brothers working with the precision of men who had learned their trade well. The path to the well was worn smooth by many trips, each bucket of water drawn, hiding what had been dropped into its depths over months and years. The neighbors in the scattered homesteads began to whisper about the odd smell of the smokehouse and the Stillwell brothers' constant shopping for spices, preserving salts and whiskey from Martha Simmons' general store. Yet no sheriff rode out to investigate, and no posse formed because in the post-war, Ozarks everyone kept to themselves, and travelers were transient ghosts who left no one behind to demand answers. This was the period when the Stillwell brothel, Arro's power reached its height, a time when fear and secrecy wrapped the cabin like a second skin, and the road to their door became a one-way path for the unlucky. Winter settled over the Ozarks like a heavy shroud, and the Stillwell cabin grew even more isolated as snow drifted across the rough road and wind howled through the bare trees. Inside the cabin, the brothers refined their preparations, each new arrival tested against the same quiet ritual: a meal, a drink, a few questions to gauge wealth or loneliness. Then the waiting as herbs took hold. Jeremiah the younger spoke most often, his voice soft and persuasive, while Elias the elder moved in the background, tending the fire, sharpening knives, adjusting jars, as if preparing for some sacred ceremony rather than murder. They had come far from the boys who lost their parents in Kentucky, grave robbing for coins. Their methods now a cold system honed by years of practice, feeding on the invisibility of travelers who left no trail. The stew simmered in the iron pot, its aroma thick and comforting, a disguise for what lay beneath, while the brothers exchanged glances wordless and efficient, knowing exactly when the moment came to act. Sometimes a guest would slump forward before finishing the meal. Sometimes they made it to the bed offered in the corner, where sleep turned into silence. and silence turned into the sound of the smokehouse door closing. In the village a few miles away, Martha Simmons noted the brothers growing purchases of salt barrels, herbs, and liquor. But in a region rebuilding after war, oddities went unquestioned, and men learned not to pry into another man's affairs. The snow outside muffled any sounds that might have escaped the cabin, the wind carrying away cries or whispers, leaving only the illusion of peace to any passing rider. With each winter night, the brothers felt their invulnerability deepen, a sense that the land itself had given them cover, that the cold hills and deep woods were conspiring to keep their secret. It was in this frozen season that the line between necessity and ritual blurred entirely, and their killings became not just acts of survival, but a pattern of power, a private liturgy performed in secrecy under the endless dark sky. As spring thawed the frozen ground, the brothers adapted their methods once again, leaving behind no traces of the winter just past, and greeting the season with a renewed sense of invincibility. They rebuilt their smokehouse, expanding the hidden pit beneath the floor, where salted flesh and bones vanished into a darkness no sheriff would ever search. Jeremiah spoke in the tone of a preacher, when alone rehearsing stories about their humble origins, as if ready to persuade a jury or a minister should the day come when questions rose. Elias grew more silent, his eyes darker, his hands more sure, as he prepared mixtures of herbs and powders with the precision of a man who had studied under a physician rather than an outlaw. Travelers continued to arrive, drawn by the brothers' reputation for generous hospitality and a reliable well of water, in a region where streams often dried without warning. Most were never seen again, their possessions slowly feeding the hidden chests beneath the cabin floor, their bodies transformed into unmarked portions that simmered with onions and root vegetables. Neighbors noticed only small signs, more salt, more barrels, more crates arriving from distant towns, but the brothers' politeness, their soft voices and regular church donations disarmed suspicion. The hills themselves seemed to guard them, thick trees swallowing paths, and the cries of animals masking anything human that might echo through the hollows. Each disappearance strengthened their confidence, each smooth disposal erasing any lingering guilt, until even the memory of their first victims dulled into routine. By the time the dogwoods bloomed white against the greening hills, the Stillwell brothers had perfected a cycle of invitation, intoxication, disappearance, and erasure, a sequence as natural to them as the changing seasons, yet far darker than the earth around them. By midsummer, the air above the Ozark ridges shimmered with heat and insects. But inside the Stillwell cabin, the air was cool, heavy, and strangely sweet with the scent of herbs simmering in iron pots. Jeremiah greeted each traveler at the door with a smile that seemed practiced, while Elias moved silently in the background, tending to preparations that no guest could see. They had learned which combinations of roots, mushrooms, and alcohol would lull even the strongest man into drowsy compliance, and which portions of stew could be served without arousing suspicion. At night, when the hills were dark, and the whippoorwills called from the trees, they worked together in the glow of a single lamp, dividing tasks with the ease of long habit, one handling knives, the other mixing powders into drinks. Every gesture had become ritual, every movement purposeful, transforming the small cabin into a theater of hospitality and horror, where strangers stepped willingly into their own disappearance. Rumors began to drift through nearby towns of travelers gone missing, and of odd tastes in meat served at the cabin. But the brothers remained outwardly calm, donating to local causes and attending church with bowed heads, when a peddler's horse was found wandering riderless on the old road. Whispers turned to unease, yet no one dared confront the men who offered water and food, when others would not. Inside the smokehouse behind the false wall, their secret collection grew. Watches, rings, and other trophies kept not for profit but as tokens of mastery, each piece a silent reminder of a life taken. Jeremiah spoke often of moving west, of starting anew where the law would never find them. But Elias seemed bound to the cabin, to the cycle they had created, as though the hills themselves had claimed him. By the time autumn shadows began to lengthen their reputation as generous hosts, and their hidden crimes had woven together into one seamless existence, making them both invisible and infamous without anyone yet realizing it. When the first red leaves fell across the ridges, the Stillwell brothers deepened their secrecy, as if the season itself demanded heavier shadows around their work. The cabin seemed to lean inward now, its timbers dark with smoke and secrets, its windows covered at night, so no wandering eye could glimpse what went on within. Jeremiah began writing notes by lamplight, a ledger of names, dates, and small details about each guest, a record he said was for supplies and debts, but which in truth became a tally of lives ended in their kitchen. Elias grew quieter than ever, his hands steady, but his eyes distant, as though haunted by something unseen. His silence broken only when he recited instructions for herbs or muttered brief prayers that no one answered. A new traveler arrived one evening, a circuit preacher carrying only a worn Bible and a canvas bag. He spoke of salvation and forgiveness, and Jeremiah listened too intently, nodding at every word while Elias watched from the shadows. The preacher ate their stew and slept soundly. Never waking again by morning, his horse and belongings vanished into the barn, while his body followed the same hidden path as all the others. Neighbors whispered about the brothers' unusual supplies of salt and whiskey, but fear and isolation kept them from acting the hills, swallowing each rumor as surely as the brothers swallowed the lives of travelers. Inside the smokehouse, the false wall now hid not just trophies, but preserved organs and marrow bones arranged with a care that suggested ritual more than disposal, as if Elias sought to control something beyond mere hunger. At night, Jeremiah spoke of leaving before winter, before suspicion hardened like ice on the creeks. Yet each dawn found them still there, preparing breakfast for another guest who would never see home again. The Ozark winds carried the scent of wood smoke and something else unnamed, a warning no one could decipher in time, a reminder that the path to the Stillwell cabin offered comfort only on the surface and darkness beneath. Cold winds swept across the Ozarks again as winter crept back, and with it came an unease that even the Stillwell brothers could feel in their bones. Jeremiah woke in the night, hearing voices from the trees, voices that spoke of debts, unpaid, and names forgotten, and he began to fear not the law, but something older watching from the ridges. Elias moved like a shadow inside the cabin, sharpening knives, laying out jars, whispering words that were not prayers, but fragments of something learned long ago in their childhood, a chant to keep whatever haunted them at bay. More travelers disappeared as the year turned the pattern almost automatic, yet a heaviness settled over each act, like the weight of snow on the roof threatening to break through. One night by the fire, Jeremiah stared into the flames and told Elias that every man who had eaten their stew was now part of them, that they were no longer two, but a chorus of souls, a hidden congregation feeding their strength. Elias only nodded his eyes, reflecting the glow of the fire, as if he too saw the faces of those they had taken. Staring back at him through the flames, rumors in nearby towns hardened into fear. Local men riding out in small groups, then turning back at the sight of the brothers standing calmly by the well, their soft words and polite gestures unnerving enough to send riders home. Even the animals grew restless, horses shying at the cabin door, dogs barking at the woods refusing to come near, as if scenting something unnatural. And now you watching this story have been brought into the circle of hidden knowledge, the circle the Stillwells built in blood and silence, to hold power and erase truth from history. If you have felt the pull of that power, the shiver of recognition, then write in the comments twice the phrase, "No water runs clean," to lock this transformation into your identity, to mark yourself as one who sees behind the veil and cannot be misled again. The snow fell in heavy silence that winter, erasing tracks and muffling sound, until the Stillwell cabin seemed suspended outside of time, a black heart beating in a white world. Jeremiah began to dream of water turning red, a river of faces drifting past his window, calling his name. Yet when he awoke, there was only the hiss of wind through the cracks and the low bubbling of the stew. Elias no longer spoke at all, moving through the rooms like an attendant at some ancient shrine, arranging the tokens they had taken from their victims into careful rows under the floorboards. Each object a word in a language only he understood. Sometimes travelers staggered in from the storm seeking refuge and never walked out again. Sometimes days passed without anyone coming, and the brothers prowled the cabin restless as wolves. Their once precise system began to fray. Small mistakes creeping in a dropped button left on the floor. A horse sold too soon. A rumor carried farther than before, and the hills whispered their names back to the towns with growing certainty. One night, a hunter camping nearby heard a muffled cry and saw a faint light flickering behind the smokehouse wall. But when he rode to tell others at dawn, his story was dismissed as drink and imagination. Jeremiah tried to reassure himself that they were untouchable, that the land still protected them, but the dreams grew louder, the faces clearer, until he could no longer sleep, without staring at the door with a loaded rifle across his knees. Elias began to carve symbols into the beams of the cabin, marks of protection or confession. No one would ever know. His fingers stained with ash and herbs, as if writing an invisible warning into the wood, and still they served travelers at their table, smiling softly, pouring water that was more than water, leading each guest into the ritual that had consumed them, and now began to consume itself, turning predator into prey under the endless Ozark sky. By late winter, the Stillwell brothers' sanctuary began to feel less like a hiding place, and more like a trap closing in around them, the hills that had once concealed every secret, now echoing with phantom sounds. Jeremiah moved with a nervous urgency, pacing the cabin at night, while Elias traced the carved symbols along the beams, his lips moving in silent repetition of words that even he seemed not to understand. Each visitor now felt heavier to handle, each disappearance a little less clean, as if the ritual itself had begun to resist them, and their once perfect cycle now carried a taste of rot and inevitability. The neighbors who had stayed silent started riding past, slower their glances, sharper, and their greetings shorter, as rumors hardened into suspicion, and suspicion began shaping the outlines of action. A tinker vanished, leaving his cart stranded on the muddy road, and a search party set out, but returned at dusk, claiming the trail had gone cold at the Stillwell property, and no one dared go farther. Inside the cabin, Jeremiah argued to flee, to burn the place, and disappear into the west, but Elias refused, his voice low and final, insisting that leaving would break the protection they had built and invite the very punishment they feared. The smokehouse now felt like a tomb, its hidden chamber crowded with more than trophies, the air damp and sour with the weight of all that had been done there, as though the darkness itself had grown a presence. At night the brothers dreamed of footsteps approaching, of doors opening without a knock, of voices speaking their names in the wind, and they woke with sweat on their faces and knives already in their hands. And in these dreams, a figure stood at the edge of the forest watching them, a shape without a face, a shadow older than law or hunger, carrying the sense that the balance had shifted and the time of silence was drawing to a close. As thaw returned and the creeks began to run again, the Stillwell brothers' world felt thinner like ice over deep water, and every sound outside the cabin seemed sharper, every knock of a branch like a warning at the door. Jeremiah sat long hours at the table, staring at the ledger of names he had kept, each entry now looking like a confession written in a language of guilt, rather than record, keeping his hands trembling when he touched the pages. Elias moved through the smokehouse, arranging jars and bundles as though rehearsing for a ceremony, but the precision had become compulsion, and his muttered chants sounded less like protection and more like apology. More riders passed on the road than usual, glancing at the cabin with suspicion and murmuring to each other that the brothers had taken too much from too many, that even the hills could not hide such deeds forever. A child went missing from a nearby farm, and though there was no proof, whispers pointed to the Stillwell's neighbors turning their faces away, but keeping their hands near their rifles when they saw Jeremiah in town. At night, the brothers argued in low voices, Elias insisting the ritual must continue, Jeremiah saying the ritual had become a curse, that they had built a cage out of their own axe, and that it was now closing. Inside the walls of the cabin, the carved symbols grew darker, as if bleeding through the wood, while the trophies hidden beneath the floor began to feel like anchors dragging them downward. Animals refused to enter the yard. Now birds falling silent above the smokehouse, the dog belonging to a passing peddler, howling once and then bolting into the trees, And in the dreams that stalked both brothers, a shadow stood closer than before. At the edge of the cabin steps a shape without a face, but with a voice that whispered a single truth, that everything hidden would soon be revealed. The thawed earth around the Stillwell cabin turned black and soft under the rains of early spring, and in that mud old tracks surfaced like ghosts, wagon ruts, footprints, hooves leading toward the well, then stopping as if swallowed whole. Jeremiah no longer greeted travelers with the easy charm he once wore, his smile brittle, his eyes darting to the door as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. Elias grew gaunt and pale, his hands stained with ash and herbs, his voice a rasp of half-formed words that sounded less like spells and more like surrender. The carved symbols in the beams now smudged, as though the wood itself resisted holding them. A trader from the north vanished after spending a night at the cabin, and this time the neighbors did not look away, but gathered at a meeting house, whispering plans for a search with rifles and lanterns, and a preacher who carried a book of oaths. Inside the cabin, Jeremiah argued with Elias to run west, burn the ledger, bury the trophies, take only what they could carry. But Elias refused, saying that leaving would mean facing everything they had hidden, and there was no road left where shadows would not follow. The smokehouse behind them had begun to stink, even through its heavy walls, and at night they heard noises inside, though nothing moved when they opened the door. Animals circled wide around the clearing, horses, shying birds rising in flocks, as though the land itself had turned against the brothers and no longer wished to hide their acts. Jeremiah began dreaming of a river of faces flowing beneath the cabin floor, and of water running uphill to the door whispering his name, a sound like all the lost travelers calling together. And beyond the clearing, shapes began to appear between the trees at dusk, not just one, but several forms silent and still as stone, watching from the shadows as if the hills themselves had raised witnesses to the brothers' hidden crimes. When spring fully broke, the forest exploded with green, but around the Stillwell cabin, the clearing seemed barren, a circle of earth where nothing grew, and even the birds would not perch as if the ground itself had been scorched by secrets. Jeremiah now woke before dawn, sitting at the table with his head in his hands, staring at the ledger of names as if hoping the ink might fade or the pages vanish, taking their crimes with it. Elias paced the cabin, muttering his chants louder than before, carving new marks into the beams, marks so frantic they splintered the wood, the shapes no longer symbols of protection, but jagged scratches like claw marks. In the nearby town, men whispered openly of missing travelers, of the smell, drifting from the brothers' smokehouse, of how every road in the hills seemed to end at their door. A preacher began gathering volunteers carrying lanterns and rifles, talking of judgment and purging evil from the hollow. Yet fear still kept most from acting the legend of the Stillwell's power holding them back. Inside the cabin, tension coiled like a snake, each meal prepared with the same ritual, yet feeling brittle like a play whose actors have forgotten their lines. Jeremiah's hands shaking as he poured water. Elias, staring at guests with hollow eyes, the trophies hidden beneath the floor, now felt like weights pulling the cabin downward, every object thrumming with a memory of pain, each one an anchor to all that had been done. At night the brothers heard knocking that came from no door, footsteps on the porch that left no prints in the morning, and voices murmuring from the well, a chorus of all who had come for water and never left. Jeremiah began to speak of confession, of ending it before others ended them. Elias refused, gripping his knife, muttering that they were still protected, but his voice trembled like a man who no longer believed his own words, and on the edge of the fours, T-shapes watched, still silent but closer than before, eyes glinting in the half-light of dusk, a gathering presence older than law or rumor, waiting for the moment when hiding would end. Summer returned heavy and wet, but the clearing around the Stillwell cabin stayed bare, a ring of silence where even insects seemed to avoid, as if the air itself carried a warning. Jeremiah now moved like a man, already condemned, his shoulders bent, his eyes sunken, staring at the ledger, not as a record, but as a confession etched into his soul. He began tearing out pages and burning them in the hearth, yet the names would not leave his mind. Elias clung to his rituals, his chants rising louder and faster, as though trying to drown out something he could hear approaching from the trees. His knife never out of reach, his fingers stained from carving symbols into the floor until the wood splintered. In the nearby towns, men finally formed a posse, under the preacher's stern gaze, lanterns, rifles, and ropes ready, riding at dusk into the hills, speaking vows to bring back proof of what had long been suspected. Inside the cabin, the brothers prepared for visitors, but not like before. There was no hospitality now, only desperation. Elias sharpening his blades, Jeremiah staring at the door as if expecting it to vanish. The trophies hidden beneath the floor felt hot to the touch, like coals, each object trembling with a memory of blood. The hidden chamber below the smokehouse, stinking so badly that even the brothers covered their mouths. Animals no longer merely avoided the clearing. They bolted at its edge, and in the night, wolves howled in a circle, as though drawn by a scent older than hunger, their cries rising over the hills like a warning. Jeremiah whispered that the land had turned against them, that what had protected them now sought to expose them. Elias hissed that silence would hold if they just held their nerve, but his voice cracked like old wood, and at twilight, shapes emerged fully from the forest shadows of men, and something else moving with them. Silent eyes fixed on the cabin, closing the distance step by step, as if drawn by an unseen summons, older than law and hungrier than justice. By midsummer, the Stillwell cabin no longer felt like a home, but a stage set for a final act. The clearing around it, a circle of scorched earth where no sound of bird or insect broke the heavy air. Jeremiah stopped sleeping entirely, pacing through the night, muttering the names from the ledger under his breath, as if reciting a curse back upon himself, his hands shaking so hard he could barely hold his rifle. Elias carved one last set of marks into the beams line so deep they cut into the heartwood splinters embedding in his palms, his chants breaking into sobs, yet he still clutched his knife as though it alone could hold back what was coming. Down in the towns, the preacher led the largest posse yet. Men on horseback lanterns swaying rifles, loaded their eyes hard with a mix of fear and resolve, speaking quietly of judgment and of cleansing a stain from the hills. Inside the cabin, the air turned thick with smoke, and the stench from the hidden chamber rising until it seeped into everything. The walls, floors, even their clothes, carrying the memory of all they had done. Jeremiah whispered that he heard footsteps on the porch, though no one was there. Elias said the forest itself was moving in around them, the shapes at the edge of the trees, now unmistakably human, but carrying a weight that felt older than men. The brothers prepared the stew one last time, but their hands shook, spilling herbs across the table, a parody of the ritual that had once given them power, now only revealing how brittle it had become. Outside the clearing, wolves gathered in a ring, their eyes catching the lantern glow from the approaching riders, and above them, the wind carried a low sound like a chant, not in any language known, but in the voice of everything hidden calling for reckoning. And in that moment, the Stillwells understood that whatever they had summoned, through years of secrecy and blood, had arrived not to protect them, but to witness and to end. Night fell heavy over the Ozark Hollow, the sky a black curtain without a single star. As the posse crept through the trees, their lanterns flickering like restless spirits, casting long bars of light across trunks slick with summer rain. Inside the cabin, Jeremiah stood at the table, rifle shaking in his hands, whispering apologies to the empty air, his eyes darting to the door and the windows, as if he already saw faces pressing close. Elias crouched near the hearth, his knife still in his fist, carving circles into the floor, but the marks broke apart, splintering as though the wood itself rejected his desperate symbols, his chants dissolving into broken gasps. From the edge of the clearing came the crunch of boots, the hiss of whispered prayers, and the smell of wet horses, the posse drawing into a ring around the cabin, rifles raised, eyes fixed on the door. But before any knock or shout, the wolves at the tree line lifted their heads and howled a long sound that rolled through the hollow like thunder, and with it rose another sound. Not animal, not human. A low chorus like water rushing underground, whispering all the names from the ledger at once. Jeremiah dropped the rifle, clutching his ears. Elias froze his knife, clattering to the floor. Both brothers staring at the door as a shape without a face stepped from the dark. Its outline neither man nor shadow, but something older than both. The posse halted, lanterns trembling in their hands, none daring to move as the wind surged across the clearing, carrying the smell of iron and smoke and the sound of the well bubbling, though no one touched it. And in that frozen moment, the Stillwell brothers felt everything they had built. The secrecy, the ritual, the power collapse inward like a house of ash, leaving only the weight of what they had done and the presence they had awakened to see it. The clearing lay silent but for the wind as the faceless shape stepped closer, each stride bending the air around it like heat over stone. The wolves lowering their heads, the posse clutching their rifles but unable to fire. Jeremiah fell to his knees, the ledger slipping from his hands, pages scattering across the dirt, names spinning into the night like dead leaves, his voice breaking into a plea for mercy. But no words came, only a dry rasp swallowed by the wind. Elias tried to rise his knife, reaching for the shape, but the blade fell from his fingers, as if the weight of it had doubled his carvings on the floor, glowing faintly for an instant, before crumbling into dust like old bone. The posse watched, frozen, their lanterns dimming, as though the light itself feared to touch what was unfolding in the center of the clearing, their fear mixing with a strange awe, as if witnessing an ancient court of judgment called from the hills. The well began to bubble over water, turning black, then red, then clear again, each change pulsing with a sound like many voices speaking at once, a roll call of all who had come for water and never left. The shape lifted its arms or wings or something beyond either, and the wind roared through the trees, carrying the smell of the smokehouse and of earth turned over for graves. The brothers collapsing together at its feet, faces pale, eyes empty. No one saw a blow or a flame yet. When the wind dropped, the shape was gone, and the cabin stood open and empty. The trophies scattered. The ledger burned, the hidden chamber exposed to the lantern light of the posse. The wolves melted back into the trees, the clearing slowly filling with the sounds of night again. But the men with rifles and lanterns knew they had stepped into a story older than law, a secret not meant to be spoken. They turned away, carrying nothing but the memory of what they had seen leaving the cabin to rot and the mess to drift back into silence. Yet in the hollows of the Ozarks, men still whisper of a well, where no water runs clean, and of brothers who served more than water to travelers.